The day and hour that no one knows, famously mentioned by the Messiah in Matthew chapter 24, verse 36, is directly connected to the timeline that is sealed in the book of Daniel until the time of the end. What that means is this. Those in the first century didn't know the day and hour, but we will know the day and the hour, and those outside of the faith will not know the day and hour. Both Daniel and the Messiah confirm this. These are not conflicting statements, but instead detail exactly what was predicted by the prophet Daniel and retaught by our Messiah. He wasn't teaching anything new, but what was already established by the prophet Daniel as true. To understand this, we must start with the verse that is all too often copied and pasted outside of its stated present tense context and inappropriately forced to be future tense beyond the Messiah's words. Matthew chapter 24, verse 36. But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. This is where many start and stop reading, and consequently and unfortunately, so does any meaningful understanding. Not only is the surrounding context often missed, but it must also be recognized that this verse says that no one knows the day and hour. It doesn't say that no one will ever know, and there's a reason for that. There's likely an intended literal and an idiomatic understanding of the day and hour that no one knows. We will cover both. As many already know, the Messiah often spoke in idioms. For example, the Messiah said to Nathanael in John chapter 1, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." To us, that makes little sense. Just as us saying, "Does a cat have your tongue?" would make little sense to the first century Jew. Here, our Messiah used a strong figure of speech pointing to a commonly taught Jewish expectation concerning the resurrection and the millennium. In short, he told Nathanael that he will be alive on the last day to inherit the land promised to Abraham. From the Messiah's words, Nathanael understood that he would participate in the resurrection, since that day was future. How did Messiah communicate this to Nathanael? This is understood in the first century Jewish figure of speech, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree," which refers to the life and study of Torah in the millennium. The millennial, or Day of the Lord concept of the fig tree is found throughout the scriptures, including Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 3, verse 10. "In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor to come under his vine and under his fig tree." That day is referring to the day of the Lord, the start of the 1,000-year reign, which begins with a resurrection. Thus, from the Messiah's words, Nathanael understood that he would participate in the resurrection, since that day was still well in the future. For this reason, Nathanael responded emphatically. John chapter 1, verse 49. "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." The Messiah used dozens of Jewish idioms in his teachings and interactions with others, and this was just one of many available examples. The mentioning of not knowing the day and hour in connection to the Messiah's return is suspected to be another idiomatic example, and the reasoning goes something like this. In Leviticus chapter 23, we can find all of the prophetic and messianic moedim that perfectly illustrate what the Messiah is supposed to do and when he is supposed to do them. We find that the Messiah prophetically fulfilled Passover, unleavened bread, firstfruits, and Pentecost in his first coming, and in that specific order. The next thing the Messiah needs to do is to return for the resurrection. This will occur on the prophetic fulfillment of the seventh-day Sabbath, which is also found in Leviticus chapter 23, as it prophetically represents the 1,000-year reign of our Messiah. We see his return and our resurrection thematically connected to a day of trumpets, shouting, and the beginning of our day of rest at the start of the seventh millennium. The next prophetic messianic day that follows Pentecost in order is the Day of Trumpets, or Yom Teruah. Then comes the Day of Atonement, and lastly, Tabernacles. In Hebrew, Yom Teruah, as the Day of Trumpets, literally means the day of shouting and the blowing of trumpets, which results in a perfect thematic connection. It's also a rest day, which is an additional thematic requirement. The Day of Trumpets always lands in the seventh month, which also necessarily represents the return at the start of the seventh millennium. We also know that the seventh millennium, or the seventh day, is also the day of the Lord. Teruah is intimately connected to the start of the day of the Lord. For example, Teruah is also connected with the fearsome day of the Lord in the book of Joel. Joel chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. Blow a trumpet in Zion. Sound an alarm, Teruah, on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is near, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Thus, Yom Teruah is the only day that is consistent with all prophetic requirements. How does the Day of Trumpets also connect idiomatically? This messianic dress rehearsal is the only prophetic day of the Lord that lands on the first of the month, and thus requires careful observation of the moon to declare the official occurrence of that day. The day is not truly declared and known until the moon marks its occurrence by means of observation. Thus, the day no man knows could reasonably be a brilliant idiom for the Day of Trumpets for the Messiah's return. In fact, it's only in the modern age in which we can calculate the moon's cycle down to the minute. Thus, Yom Teruah may be idiomatically understood as the day that no man knows. Despite all of that, we cannot ignore the literal nature of what the Messiah said, because there's clearly more to it than simply a fascinating Hebraic idiom. A few verses later, we read Matthew chapter 24, verse 42. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Thus, the day and hour is certainly referring the return of the Lord. This is also in present tense, not future tense, just like Matthew chapter 24, verse 36. Those in the first century are not supposed to know the day of the Messiah's coming. More importantly, they are told to stay awake because the day is not known. Does that mean that if one stays awake, that we will eventually know the day? We'll examine that idea shortly, but first let's back up further. Why is the Messiah talking about the timing of his return? Because the disciples asked him these questions. Matthew chapter 24, verse 3. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming, and of the end of the age?" Why would the disciples ask about when these things would be and the sign of the Messiah's coming at the end of the age? They asked these questions because the Messiah prophesied that the temple was going to be destroyed. Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 2. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly, I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." The disciples understandably wanted to know not only when the temple would be destroyed when they asked when these things would be, but also when the Messiah would be returning. The disciples were requesting the timeline for the end of the age. In the minds of the disciples, if the temple was going to be destroyed, then surely that is the end of the age, and surely the Messiah would then return. But that assumption was flawed, and we have the last 2,000 years to prove it. The Messiah listed events that would lead up to the destruction of the temple, listed events that would occur after the destruction of the temple, and then listed events that would occur just before his return. After all of those things, the Messiah then answered the questions, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Before we reveal how the Messiah answered their question, we should understand that the prophet Daniel asked the very same question long ago. Daniel chapter 12, verse 6. How long shall it be till the end of these wonders? What wonders are Daniel referring to? Daniel asked this question regarding the Great Tribulation and the resurrection to come. Daniel wanted to know when the tribulation would end and the resurrection would occur, as mentioned in the previous verses. Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. At that time shall arise